Welcome back to the WBZ Gubernatorial debate live from our studios in Boston. And let's resume our debate here. And Mr. Falchuk, you'll lead off on this question. We're going to get back to the policy stuff in a moment, but here's a question that hopefully will give us a little insight into your character. What was the most difficult decision you ever had to make in your professional life? And why did you decide the way you did? 45 seconds.
It was actually the decision to go about founding a new independent party and running for governor. It's a departure from a successful business career, and talking with my wife and with our kids who have been hugely supportive, I believe the system's not representing people. And I felt like the way to change it wasn't just to run, but to build a new party based on the idea that everyone is equal, that everyone's civil rights have to be protected, and the government's got to spend taxpayer dollars wisely. I think we have an obligation and an opportunity to inspire people about the chance to be involved. When we see 16% of people voting in the primary, it's a terrible sign for our democracy. When a majority of our legislators run unopposed, it's not good for resolving these issues. So it was a tough choice, but I feel honored to have the opportunity to be a part of this.
Thank you. Mr. Lively.
That's a tough question. I've made a lot of career choices that were difficult to make. The one, I suppose, that was more challenging in recent years, I closed down a successful law firm in Southern California. I was the managing partner of Lively, Ackerman and Cowles. In order to go back on the mission field, I gave up substantial salary, and really was a very, very good, lucrative business. My wife and I now run an inner-city mission in Springfield, Massachusetts. We bought an abandoned house in the middle of the hood. We set up our church is called Holy Grounds Coffee House. It serves the most disadvantaged people in our society, but it was worth it.
Thank you. Mr. McCormick.
John, I'd have to say it's starting up a company to treat ALS, and it was a struggle, and neurological diseases are extremely complicated. And in growing that company and going through clinical trials and having outcomes of a trial that didn't make sense to anyone, that was a real gut check moment. My wife and I talked about it. We had to more than double down. It was a huge investment, and it was something that we just felt it was the right thing to do, because not only do we believe it's going to ultimately help ALS patients, but we think our findings in the laboratory are going to lead to other neurological diseases, like some breakthroughs in Parkinson's and Alzheimer's, which other people are going to pick up and take to the next level. So that was a really very, very tough decision.
Thank you. Mr. Baker.
Career decision or professional?
Professional. Well, you can define it however you want.
Okay. When Harvard Pilgrim was in terrible trouble, we made a decision to exit the Rhode Island marketplace. That involved thousands of people, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of members, and that was easily the hardest decision I ever had to make. And I'm proud to say that we worked overtime to make sure everybody who was in active treatment stayed in active treatment. We made sure that every provider organization that did business with us got paid for the services they rendered. And we did everything we could to make sure every single person who worked for the organization had an opportunity to find other employment as we went through that process. But that was a classic example of having absolutely no way out and no good choice, and we had to make it. And to this day, I still think it's the toughest decision I ever had to make.
Thank you. Ms. Coakley.
So the easy decision for me was, after law school and working in a big firm, making a call to go into public service. The hardest decision was, once I was there, working with District Attorney Tom Riley, and asked to go down to head up our child abuse unit. You know, I watched a lot of Perry Mason as a kid. I wanted to do homicides. I wanted to be in the courtroom trying cases for victims. And this was the hardest job I have ever had, and the hardest decision. I hadn't done child abuse cases before. It was a time, I think, as Charlie knows, that numbers of cases were growing, including physical abuse cases. So we started to do work with doctors around broken limbs and fractured skulls, and of course when 8-year-old Maddie Eapen ended up in the emergency room, we have that case. But I worked across a range of cases. It made me a much better district attorney and a much better, I think, prosecutor and problem solving around domestic violence and child abuse.
By the way, I should have noted this was a question submitted via CBSBoston.com from Steve in Arlington. Would anyone like to follow up or rebut anything that they heard here? Go ahead.
I just want to congratulate Jeff. I mean, one of the good pieces of news I heard this summer after all the crazy stuff around the Ice Bucket Challenge was that because of the money that was raised on that, the clinical trials have been, you know, they're ahead by 3 or 4 years now. So that kind of debilitating disease, and what we're actually able to do in Massachusetts with our biotech, our life sciences, people like Jeff are willing to invest in it, means not only it's an economic driver for Massachusetts, it means people's lives are going to be better.
Isn't it odd that the only one with biotech investing experience, personally and professionally, was disinvited from the biotech meeting?
Further comment, or I'll move on. All right, let's move ahead here, and you'll start here, Mr. Lively. Let's turn back to an issue now that made the top 5 issues on voters' minds, according to the WBZ UMass Amherst poll, Homeland Security. The U.S. Supreme Court yesterday declined to hear the appeal of Tarek Mahana of Sudbury of his conviction on terrorism charges. Meanwhile, Mahana associate Ahmed Abu Samra of Stoughton is on the FBI's most wanted terrorist list, and he's believed to be a key ISIS operative. These are only the most recent names on a growing list of terror suspects and perpetrators from Massachusetts. And Boston is one of just 3 U.S. cities where the feds are focusing efforts to deter recruitment of terrorists. So here's my question. Is Massachusetts in some way a magnet for terrorists? If so, why? And what would you do as governor to help proactively identify them before they act out?
Well, I think, yes, Massachusetts is a target because it's a liberal state. If you look around the world, the place where radical Islamists are going are the most liberal countries. The Netherlands, England, Sweden, and in the United States, they're going to the states that have the highest Democrat populations and greatest amount of power. It's because they know that they can get away with more in a society where there's just not a lot of scrutiny, where people don't have guns to defend themselves. The places they're going are places where they have the strongest gun laws. They're going to the places where the government is concentrated at the highest, and so there's no local focus.
Thank you, Mr. McCormick.
I don't think we're really a magnet, other than the fact that we are a very cosmopolitan area, and we have a lot of influence on what happens in the United States and, in fact, in the world. And I think that people from abroad who want to inflict terror, they want to get an impact. So, of course, they're going to go to the kinds of cities that they think that they can make that and be seen. You know, they're not going to go to nowhere. They're going to come to some of the major northeastern cities, for example, John. I think what we need to do as governor, we have to work with our federal government very, very closely. Those agencies don't talk to each other well at all. Obviously, our state agencies don't either. And a lot of this is going to come down to just relentless use of technology and vigilance.
Thank you, Mr. Baker.
Well, I would agree with Jeff's opening comment there that I think the cosmopolitan nature of Massachusetts and Boston has something to do with it. I mean, we have a lot of people who come here to go to school. We have a lot of people who come here to work. We have a lot of people who visit here. We're a terrific location geographically in terms of someone's ability to get to and from a lot of different places from here. And I think as a result of that, as governor, there's probably no single priority that should be higher than the protection and public safety of the people here. And I can just tell you that as governor, I would make sure that my administration was in constant contact with federal agencies, city agencies, national security agencies, and I would take a personal interest in making sure that we did everything we could to stay on top of everything that's going on in the cyber community, in the maritime community, and in the community generally.
Thank you. Ms. Coakley, 45 seconds.
So, John, I remember like it was yesterday. I was district attorney on the 2nd floor in the tallest building in East Cambridge on 9/11, and we knew that after that second plane hit that the country was being attacked. And so even in Boston, we later learned those planes had come from there, but we had to leave that building. And as a result of that, though, and I know this because as district attorney working in the Organized Crime Strike Force, since that time, with in the state level and improving communications, we have a terrorism task force. We stay in touch all the time. And what we need to do as governor is make sure that we continue that communication, that we look at better threat assessment tools, because New York, Boston, all of those cities will be, and that we continue to coordinate efforts to deter threats, to respond as we did in the Boston Marathon as soon as we can, and keep that communication going.
Thank you, Mr. Falchuk.
The world is a dangerous place, and the government has a important obligation to make sure that everyone is kept safe. What I'm worried about what's happened over the last decade with the war on terror is that our civil liberties are increasingly being encroached on. When we saw in Boston, after the marathon bombing and the heroic work that was done by the police, but as residents of Massachusetts, we were told stay in our homes. In my community, that happened. When you saw the very militarized police in the streets, this is a worrisome development. And when you think about the words of the national anthem calling us, this is the home of the brave, we're brave. We can handle the kinds of threats that exist in the world. So yes, law enforcement needs all the tools that it has, but our civil liberties should not be negotiable.
Rebuttal, anyone?
Sure.
Go ahead.
On that Friday, I know I went to where all the police were masked because we didn't know who was at large and where they were. We understood that the judicial system has to control that. I worked to make sure that we would get search warrants for places in Cambridge, because if we were ever going to bring cases, we knew they would be held to the U.S. Constitution. And I know we have to have a balance between the way we get information and collect it, but we are dealing now with out borders, people who will come out and having information, sharing information, doing threat assessment under the rule of law is the way we'll keep safe in the future.
Response? Go ahead, and then
the rule of law has been increasingly interpreted to allow the government to snoop on people's email, to conduct wireless surveillance in ways that were not previously. We've got secret commissions happening.
Then we need to respond with the rule of law and not be subject to terrorist threats.
But this is what's happening. It's been happening at the state level as well. And so we need leaders that are willing to say, listen, we got to stand up against these terrorists. They need to be held to account, but also to protect people's rights.
I'm going to get you in, and then Mr. Lively's waiting patiently. Go ahead.
I was just going back to something Evan said back at the beginning of the conversation, which is, of the debate, which is that public leaders, public officials need to be forthright and public with people and open with them about the decisions that they make. And I happen to think on this particular one, most of the people that I know and most of the people I've talked to about the issues around surveillance and phone calls and wiretaps and all the rest, the big issue people had was that this was all going on and no one in the government was telling them about it. I also think people are not only brave, I think they're old enough and mature enough to have a conversation about this, and I think that's part of what's been missing.
I want to inject one thing here that I would add to my original comments, and that is the problem that we have with immigration. That we need to close the borders from illegal immigrants. I mean, to stop bringing so many radical Islamists into our country through the legitimate immigration policy. That if you look and you see where the radicals are going, they're also going to the places that have the most liberal policies regarding immigration. We're upside down on that.
You made that point. Rebuttal to that?
Sure. I mean, I think we do need a system that is fair to people, including residents who are here, and that means that you need the rule of law and ability to make sure we have information that we can assess and protect. And there are times, Charlie, and I know this, when you can't tell everybody what you're doing in real time. But I do believe government information should always be made public at some stage.
Go ahead, Mr. McCormick.
61% of the companies founded in the Commonwealth are founded by immigrants. This country was built largely by immigrants. Most of us are descendants of immigrants.
Legal immigrants.
People don't have a sign on them. I have friends all over the world that come here, and our government needs to do the best job possible to keep terrorists out of the country. No one would disagree with that. But it is a function of technology. It is a function of agencies working together, states working together with the federal government. It is a complicated situation.
Go ahead. I'm going to move on after this.
Working with the federal government issue, I've talked to enough folks in law enforcement at the state level to know that the federal government, to follow up on the Attorney General's comment, there are a lot of situations when the federal government is not even telling people at the state and local level about stuff that's going on in their own community. I can tell you as governor, I would be all over that. I think one of the big problems we have is just huge disconnect between what the feds know and what the states and the locals know, and that has to change.
All right, briefly, if you have any more on this, then I want to move on.
There wouldn't be things having to be hidden from us if we just hadn't brought so many people, troublemakers, into our country.
Go ahead.
All I know is that what we face and the challenges we face ahead are not going to be solved by inciting fear and prejudice in people in Massachusetts and in this country. I'm not inciting fear and
prejudice. I'm saying we need to be responsible with our immigration policy and just not let people slip across that border.
All right, I'm going to move on. Thank you, candidates. You can, as I say, revisit this later on as we go along here. We spoke about health care briefly, but I want to return to that topic in a little different perspective here. And you'll start here, Mr. Lively. If Republicans win back the White House in 2016, it's entirely possible they may try to repeal at least parts of the new federal health care law. Are there any, if you're elected, you'll be in office as governor at that time. Are there any aspects of that law you would encourage Washington to change, or are you satisfied with it as is? 45 seconds, please.
I think socialized medicine is an absolute disaster for our country. I would completely repeal Obamacare and rebuild from the ground up. In fact, all the things I'm talking about, when I talked about tearing down DCF, I'm not talking about eliminating, we have to have agencies that deal with these sorts of things, but let's do it on conservative principles and not keep following these far-left ideas that take us off into la-la land.
Mr. McCormick.
John, I'm running as an independent to pull people together to solve the problems. I personally believe we should have asked for an innovation waiver. We had the most inclusive health care system in the United States, and I think we frankly should have tried to perfect that system. We should have, again, emphasized primary care and community health centers, and our large players in the Commonwealth, our large providers know that. They're making investments in that area, but at 42% of the state's budget, we have to do it much more aggressively than we're doing it now. So we have to take those models to the next level, give people better outcomes, decrease the cost of care, and these are well proven out.
Mr. Baker.
I think the most important thing the next governor would have to do with respect to what happens to the Affordable Care Act is try to make sure that most of the important decisions that matter with respect to health care and health care coverage in Massachusetts are made by people in Massachusetts. The main reason I supported pursuing a waiver, not knowing, of course, that the whole thing was going to blow up all over everybody, was because I wanted Massachusetts to continue to be in the driver's seat and to control its own destiny with respect to health care here in the Commonwealth. It's a big employer, it's an incredibly important issue, and it's one that people take personally, and I would like the Commonwealth, if there are changes to be made with respect to the Affordable Care Act, to have the latitude and the ability to make decisions about how our health care system works that are going to benefit people in Massachusetts. I fear terribly losing control of this to some bureaucracy in Washington that's never even been to Massachusetts.
Thank you, Ms. Coakley.
So this is what's at stake. If your child has a brain tumor, you want him to go to Children's Hospital. If your sister is suffering from breast cancer, you want her at a good hospital in Massachusetts. People come from all over the world to get their health care here because we do have health care that's been focused on quality care, excellent care, and what our office has done is show that it's very expensive. And I point out to AGs around the country that we have been able to put together with a Republican governor, Democratic legislature, our business community, our providers, our healthcare, our consumer advocates, a healthcare reform that said, let's cover people, let's keep it quality, now let's address costs. That's what we are doing now. It's not going to happen overnight. We need some waivers from what the federal government has looked for, but we've got the right plan here, and we know what we want to happen in Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Falchuk.
We should have gotten a waiver from those actuarial standards. They were better what we had here in Massachusetts, but more broadly, we've got to change the economic model of health care in Massachusetts. States like Maryland have put in place a fee schedule based on global budgets, which would put the risk of care onto hospitals so they could be much more efficient. As it is today, as they buy each other up, they raise their prices. So every time you pay a higher insurance premium or a higher deductible, it's because of the enabling of, as you point out, the Republicans and Democrats working together, partners becoming a monopoly, and the government allowing for this to take place. As voters, we're not going to get any different result if we keep going down the same path. I've got a very specific, clear plan on how we'll change the economics so that hospitals make their money off of keeping you well rather than treating you when you're sick.
Thank you. Rebuttal. Who wants it? Anyone? Go ahead, Mr. McCormick.
We have to have a governor who can bring people together. This is how you solve problems. We have world-class clinicians, physicians, nurses, but we also have world-class administrators and technologists. And it's going to take everyone, including providers and payers, that come up with a common solution. This is a huge problem. It does not make sense if we are all physically fit and fiscally bankrupt. We have to do this together.
Go ahead, Mr. Falchuk.
Well, the dollars that are being sent to those hospitals because of the way they can distort the market with their pricing is the issue that we face for economic development and for families' pocketbooks in the next administration. I'm willing to call out partners for what it is and to take the steps that are necessary to build the kind of fee schedule that will save consumers billions of dollars.
Super briefly, Mr. Lively.
I think the insurance corporate model versus the government socialist model is a false choice. There's a middle path of nonprofit risk pools that are much less costly, where people are not restricted in the doctors and hospitals that they can go to, and where the members are stakeholders in the billing process, which has a substantial downward pressure on cost.
All right, go ahead.
And John, as we move away from fee-for-service and trying to get into our communities more affordable and integrated health care, it is the one way we're going to be able to address mental health care and behavioral health care. We haven't talked about it tonight. It's a huge issue in Massachusetts. It's expensive because we don't deal with it, and more importantly, it creates an enormous nightmare for those who suffer from mental illness and their families.
Mr. Baker.
I just have to say that 4 of us on this panel today have talked about the waivers the Commonwealth should have pursued instead of going down the road of full speed ahead into the Affordable Care Act last year. And there's only one of us here who had representatives on the Health Connector who could have done something about that. As we sit here today, we have a broken website. We used to have the best in the country. Now we have the worst. And we've spent as a Commonwealth hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars and disrupted the care for hundreds of thousands of people.
Rich,
it didn't have to be that way.
Yeah, so I have supported the waivers that will make sense for Massachusetts because I have worked with how it's happened here, and that's what I'm talking about. We also have the appointees who are independent on healthcare, who are the best on the board. I'll stand up for my appointees on the Health Connector board.
Oh, go ahead. Do you want to rebut that first? Hold on. Did you want to rebut that? Or
one member of the board who was an independent director who actually questioned a lot of the decisions that have been made got canned about 3 weeks ago. I think this is a great example of a broken agency and one-party government. And I repeat, we're the only state in the country that had a horrible experience with rolling out the Affordable Care Act where no one lost their job. And I happen to think that has a lot to do with the lack of accountability and the lack of transparency that comes with one team on the field, one party rule, and we need to fix that.
Final words on this, then I'm going to move on. Go ahead.
We're the only state in the country that actually tried to and provided the model for what has happened at the national level. And I've been the first one to say, and consistently, that one size does not fit all. Give the states more latitude. We've shown the way in Massachusetts. Under Governor Coakley, we'll continue to do that.
Go ahead. I do want to move on.
This is another serious problem that the left has gotten us into. We shouldn't have to have waivers. Just the fact that we have to have waivers demonstrates that it's a broken system.
Okay, folks, again, you can bring this up again in our next open period, but let's move on to another question here. We're doing great. At least I think so.
As long as no one ends up in the cocoon of horror.
No, you don't want to go there. Thank you, sir. This next question comes from Barbara from the North Shore via cbsboston.com. Thank you, Barbara. In Massachusetts, voters themselves, as you know, can make laws using the initiative petition process. But the voters' decisions have not always been carried out by the legislature, most notably in the failure to roll back the income tax to 5%, as the voters ordered in 2003. If voters next month repeal the automatic gas tax indexing and the casino law, will you honor their will? And if not, do you favor the repeal of the initiative petition process? Mr. McCormick.
I do not favor the repeal of that process, but I think that process should be used judiciously. We obviously can't legislate by referendum constantly, but when the voters decide, their decision should be heard. And frankly, Charlie and Martha, I have no idea why you think you have the moral authority to trump the voters if they in fact do repeal casinos, to say, you know what, I'm going to file legislation for casinos to be legislated back in. You know, it just doesn't make sense to me. That's why we vote.
Go ahead, Mr. Baker, 45 seconds.
Well, I was one of the people who collected signatures on the question to repeal the automatic indexing on the gas tax, so I'm certainly going to vote for that, and I hope it passes, and I would be pleased to be able to implement that as governor. I'm going to vote against the casino repeal, not because I love casinos. I think Massachusetts should have one, which is what I've said for 4 years now, and I think that one should be in Springfield. If the voters choose to reject casinos completely, I will want to have a debate about the Springfield site, and we'll see what happens. And if it doesn't go anywhere, that'll be that. But I certainly believe in the petition process. I've been involved with it for most of my professional career. And unlike the Attorney General, I supported getting that casino question onto the ballot and was glad when the Supreme Judicial Court came out and said it should be on the ballot. You collect 125,000 signatures, you belong on the ballot.
Thank you, Ms. Coakley.
So interestingly, if we are going to move ahead in infrastructure development, if we're going to build a South Coast rail, if we're going to be able to fix what hasn't been able to be fixed because the economy's been so tough the last 8 years on our roads and our bridges and public transportation, We need that indexing. I support it. I know many business leaders throughout Massachusetts support it. And I think that is one good investment in what we need to provide, not just in Boston and Cambridge, but around the state, the economic plan that I've rolled out that I think makes sense and will invest in our kids and our businesses. In terms of the question, we have a job in the Attorney General's office to make a threshold issue. We knew it would go to the court. No one was disadvantaged by that. And I agree with Charlie that as the voters in Springfield voted for a casino, if it can be part of a larger economic plan, I'll support that if they still want it. But let's wait till the vote in November.
Thank you. Mr. Falchuk.
It defies credulity that if the voters go and repeal the entire casino process, that you guys would go to the legislature and say, hey, let's try to put a casino back in. I mean, it just doesn't seem like the kind of thing that even seems realistic. But we have examples throughout our government of laws that are duly passed and are not implemented. You know, Chapter 70 funding for education is supposed to be the foundation budget updated every 2 years. The last time it happened was 10 years ago. They've just started again with this. We talked about Chapter 257 for human services workers a couple of weeks ago together, where the state has not lived up to the obligations that it set out for itself. So when we have a government where it is not even following its own laws, then we've got a need for new leadership.
Thank you. Mr. Lively.
Well, Barbara, I'm with you, and I support the initiative process. In fact, I think Massachusetts should do more to respect citizen legislation. I lived in Oregon for 15 years. The citizens in Oregon can legislate directly. Here in Massachusetts, the legislators can veto the people like they did on the gay marriage vote. The citizens collected well over 100,000 signatures to put that on the ballot. And then the left put the screws to the legislators and prevented that from going to the ballot. They shouldn't be able to do that.
All right, go ahead, rebuttal time.
If I could clarify something, I am in favor of the repeal, just so the two of you are very clear on that. One of the things we need to do is look at what it's going to do to lottery revenues as well. We are going to have hundreds of communities affected negatively by that. And if you're advocates of local aid, which you say you are, that will affect them dramatically. The numbers are going to be eye-popping for some of these communities.
Responses.
Well, I just want to respond to Evan, and I know Charlie agrees with me on this because we've talked about it before. I am very proud to have been the first Attorney General in the country to challenge the Defense of Marriage Act to make sure that, as in Massachusetts, as we've now seen with the denial of cert at the Supreme Court, people can marry who they love. So I stand on that decision. I'm very proud of it.
I never suggested otherwise.
No, you didn't. Okay. I'm sorry, Scott.
Oh, okay.
All right, well, go ahead, Mr. Baker.
I didn't.
Well, since she referred to me, I want to address that, because this is an important
you know what,
issue
though,
for people
we're talking about a different issue. I'd like to conclude that discussion first. Go ahead, Mr. Baker. You want it in.
Yeah, my whole point in supporting one casino was a concern about what the collateral impact of more than one casino would be. I'm the only candidate, I believe, who's walked the site in Springfield. The site in Springfield they're planning to build that casino on is the site that was torn up by the tornado. And it's a very innovative proposal that's going to create main streets in a place where we don't have any, in a part of the Commonwealth where the unemployment rate is twice what it is everywhere else.
I live in Springfield. There's a lot of people that don't want that casino there. That's the last thing we want to do, is to enrich and empower people that are willing to exploit the weaknesses of others for their own personal gain. That's what casinos do, and I don't want any part of them.
Go ahead, Mr. Falchuk, then you, Ms. Coakley.
I'm against the repeal because of the fact that the legislature created the framework, the voters voted in the cities and towns, and that should be the end of it. And for our democracy to work right, the side that loses has to move on and join with the side that wins. We have to have that kind of government in our state.
Go ahead.
All I know is that if we don't have the income from the gas tax, we're not going to be able to grow this state the way we should to grow jobs and fill those jobs. We need to do that.
We will if we downsize the government.
Go ahead.
My one final comment on this one would be, if the legislature wants to raise the gas tax, the legislature should vote to raise the gas tax and be held accountable at the ballot box for raising the gas tax. I mean, I said when this first happened that it was a bad precedent, this idea that the tax just goes up every year without anybody doing it, and it would encourage other people to do the same thing. And sure enough, question 2 on the ballot will raise the deposit on bottles every 5 years, forever and ever and ever. This is not the way to run a cost-effective and efficient and, frankly, politically responsible government.
Go ahead. You want to respond?
Yeah,
Go
I'll
ahead.
just say quickly,
Briefly.
I mean, I don't think this is the slippery slope that you make it out to be, Charlie. And what we're really talking about, the business leader support, is if we want to move ahead in Massachusetts, we need this predictable income.
Briefly.
The adjustment to the gas tax that was made makes it work a bit like the sales tax and the income tax, so it works more like a percentage. There's a law in the books that's lowering the income tax gradually, and I don't hear people complaining about the fact that that's happening without a legislative vote. Let's be real about what's happening. We have a responsibility to deal with our infrastructure, and this is one way to pay for it.
Go ahead,
Well,
Go ahead.
My response to that one, Evan, is, as John pointed out, the voters in 2003 said they wanted the income tax to be 5%. I mean, to some extent, the legislature created this slope, which is better than nothing, I suppose. But if you were to ask the 60% of the electorate that came out in 2003 and said they wanted a 5% income tax, what they would say is we're long overdue on delivering on that.
And 10 seconds. Go ahead, Mr. McCormick.
We need an accountable legislature. We need a group of people that look at the facts and can make good decisions and that are forced to think out of the box and forced really to think about change. And we need a break from the status quo.
And candidates, on that note, believe it or not, that concludes our debate. Thank you all very much for participating, and thank you very much for watching. If you'd like to watch all or part of this debate again, go to cbsboston.com, and we invite you to follow WBZ News and WBZ News Radio 1030 for thorough coverage and analysis of campaign 2014. Most importantly, get out and vote on November 4th. Thanks so much for watching.